funds and equities. So we're seeing alts play a bigger role in that space. Direct indexing, as I mentioned, just more sophistication beyond the commoditized exposure that you see a lot of advisors using historically.
What's the best way, have you seen in your career, Commonwealth, for an advisor to grow his or her business?
The most successful advisors that I've seen have really gone through a segmentation exercise where they segment it out into A, B, C, and D clients. Generally, the clients are in the A and B bracket are bringing in the majority of the revenues, and they look towards the C and D clients as a good outsourced option. So spending your time and energy aspects of your business while outsourcing perhaps some of those clients that aren't generating as much revenue for your practice.
When you say those C and D clients outsourcing, what does that mean?
Generally smaller account sizes.
But like is that they outsource to where?
Either an internal discretionary platform that we offer or one of the other TAMP providers, turnkey asset manager platforms that we have available through our network.
How do new advisors grow their business? I mean, is there a strategy for successfully growing your business from the ground up?
It's very difficult these days to go the cold calling method, as you quite know. So what we've seen is a lot of advisors, and we have a network that we've created for anybody interested in getting into the business. We'll actually pair them up with existing offices. As you've probably seen today at or this weekend at our conference, we have a number of universities that have also been represented. So we're continuing to expand our network, both across graduates as well as undergrad areas to continue to expand that network.
What's the interest level for young kids?
We're seeing it, I would say in the past few years, it's picked up pretty significantly. It seems like for most grads, it's either financial services or tech, right? So I'd say there was a bit of a lull after the 2008 financial crisis, but in recent years, we've seen a significant uptick in interest, absolutely.
And what's the activity? I know I've been in the business since the mid-'80s. It's always been a decision for advisors at wirehouses like a Merrill Lynch or something, whether to go on the independent route. How has that changed during your career?
Yeah, it's, again, in recent years, I do a lot of the prospect visits where it's newer advisors coming in and just trying to understand our business model. More and more, we're seeing advisors coming from the wirehouse channel, whereas you go back 10, 15 years, and it was mostly transitions from the IBD space. But advisors are in the wire space are looking just for more independence. They don't want to be told what products to sell, right? They want the entire spectrum, the entire universe of the options. They want to do what's best for their clients, not necessarily what's in the best interests of their partner firm. So that's what the independent channel really offers them, is full capabilities.
All right, Peter, thanks a lot. Really interesting. Thank you so much, Peter Essela, SVP, Head of Advisory Solutions at Commonwealth Financial Network, kind of working us through a portfolio management platform for Commonwealth's advisors there. Thank you so very much. All right, taking a look at this market here, it seems to be tech back in vogue at the end of the day. You're looking at a NASDAQ that is up by over 1 percentage point, helped, of course, by NVIDIA. When you have one of your peers saying, yeah, we're ramping up supply because NVIDIA's expectations are going to outperform, that always winds up helping out.
It does. And so we've got the NASDAQ up about 1.2%. You compare that to the Dow, which is pretty much unchanged, and then the S&P 500 up 0.7%. Also want to call out oil here, seeing a pullback after that strong movement we've seen higher over the last 2 weeks due to the higher geopolitical risk in the Middle East. WTI crude oil off 4.7%, down to $73.50. Brent crude as well off 4.6%, $77.18. So a pullback there on the global oil, maybe since we have the Israeli folks coming over to Washington, D.C., so maybe some discussion about the peace coming up. So we're going to have more coming up from Orlando, Florida. Calm before the storm here. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A former New York City official has been charged with witness tampering and destroying evidence in a federal investigation that led to Mayor Eric Adams' bribery indictment. The arrest came amid yet more high-profile departures from Adams' administration. Hurricane Milton building up as a potentially disastrous storm surge as it churns towards Florida's west coast, where flooding and high winds are expected to inflict widespread damage and put lives at risk. The National Hurricane Center, in its last update, said Milton's top winds are now at 145 miles an hour. It is an update for the U.S. stock market, with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all rebounding today. Right now, the S&P is up 43, up by about 0.8%. Techs, though, by far the standout. NASDAQ up 1.2%. The NASDAQ 100 index also surging by 1.2%. The Dow up 49, a gain of 0.1%. 10-year 4.02%, with a 2-year that's yielding 3.96%. Gold down $32 the ounce, down 1.2%. 26.09 right now on the precious metal, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is declining by 4.6%. WTI 73.62 a barrel on crude oil. So again, recapping, it is an update for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. We are keeping an eye on Roblox shares. That stock declining after short seller Hindenburg Research said it is betting against the gaming platform. Roblox now down by 3.4%. For its part, Roblox has responded by saying the short report is misleading and it believes its platform is safe and secure. S&P 500 index up by 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. I'm Alexia alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are broadcasting to you from cloudy, albeit a little rainy and windy, Orlando, Florida. We are at the Commonwealth's National Conference for Financial Advisors. The theme is The Future is Now, where Commonwealth brings lots of advisors together and they talk and give ideas and they help them, guide them through the market, guide them through this volatility and this uncertain time. Well, joining us now for his take is Chris Fasciano, Senior Portfolio Manager at Commonwealth Financial Network. So when you talk to other advisors and you guys are, hanging out, doing what advisors do, and you talk about the volatility and you talk about all the uncertainty out there, is there a consensus about where markets are going?
Oh, I don't think there's a consensus at this point, but the advice that we give at Commonwealth remains the same no matter what the consensus is, and that's keep calm and carry on. There's always opportunities in the market no matter what's going on, and sometimes volatility presents those best opportunities that you can add value to clients' portfolios. So I think in general, the consensus right now in the marketplace is that the Fed will successfully and guide the economy to a soft landing, and inflation's moving in the right direction, and people view that as a supportive background for the markets.
How important are earnings for your market call, Chris? Because we're going to have JP Morgan is going to be kicking off this Friday, another round of earnings season. We'll get another look at how corporate America is doing. How do you frame out earnings for your clients?
Yes. So we're encouraged by earnings at this point, but it is an important element of the future direction of the market. Right? We look at our asset class decisions, and any investment decisions have two pieces to them: valuation and in fundamentals. You need both of those to have good long-term investments. So we've been encouraged by earnings growth. If you look at 2020, not surprisingly, because the global economy was shut down, earnings dropped. We had one good year of solid earnings growth as the economy reopened. And then in 2022 and 2023, corporate America struggled with inflationary pressures, cost increases, and earnings flatlined. The rally we saw over the last couple of years has then been due to valuations expanding. But if you look now, as you mentioned, we're about to start earnings period for the third quarter at the end of the week. Right now, consensus estimates are for 10% growth this year. And even better from an earnings perspective for next year. 15% consensus earnings growth.
And is that going to be in Mag 7, or is that going to be in the other 493 stocks?
This is the best part, I think, for the market going forward, is that for the time being, all that earnings growth has been in the Magnificent Seven. So if you come back to what I said, valuations, fundamentals, that's why those stocks have acted so well. But what we're going to see next year is the beginning of the divergence within earnings growth start to close. So you're going to start to see better earnings growth from the rest of the market, and we believe that that will lead to better breadth in the market. So you'll see not only the other 493 start to work, but small cap, mid cap, they should begin to participate as that earnings gap narrows.
How do you guys feel about, just real simply, stocks versus bonds here? Because I can now get a decent yield on my 2-year government treasury. I can, if I want to take a little credit risk, I can do a little bit more.
Bonds are relevant.
Okay.
That's how we feel about the equity bond mix, but we don't try to time the market at Commonwealth. We think it's really hard, if not impossible. So we believe that you should have allocations to whatever the appropriate equity target is for your client in fixed income. But as you point out, bonds are pretty attractive now because you can get yields across the curve. And one of the things that we have spent time talking to advisors about is to make sure that you take advantage to increase your duration and move out on the curve, where you can still get relatively attractive rates as your money market and CD rates come down. But if you look historically, anytime the Fed has cut rates, high-quality fixed income, longer duration has outperformed cash going forward.
We've asked this question to a bunch of guests over the last 2 days in terms of alternative asset allocation. And is it 60-40-0? Is it 50-40-10? Is it 60-30-10? I'm doing all that fast math. That was pretty
awesome.
good, right? Yeah, thank you. How do you look at it?
So we deliver solutions to our advisors to use for their individual client situations and deliver the appropriate allocation for them. So we offer over 100 different model suites at Commonwealth, and we have models with alternatives in our model suites that are used by our advisors. We view that as keep fixed income as your core and use alternatives. So whatever your math was, 40-40-20 would be the way we look at it, and have alternatives that tend to have equity-like exposure so you can participate but de-risk the portfolios going forward.
What are you hearing this week in Orlando from your RIAs that maybe you haven't heard in the past?
I think the big question really is fixed income. Understandably, what happened in 2022 still leaves a lot of scars.
Yep.
And people don't necessarily want to go back into fixed income if they've lost their ability to provide ballast when the equity markets provide volatility, right? And I look at it, the scenario that we had in 2022 is the perfect storm. Rates went up, they went up fast, and they surprised people. But we believe that going forward, that historical relationship between equity and fixed income will continue. And if we get into a period for equity volatility, you'll see more like 2020 where bonds went up while the equity market. So we're having those conversations with advisors of getting people comfortable back in the bond space.
Oh, what's their biggest misconception, you think, about that thesis?
Oh, I think people look, and it's human nature, right? We all look at short-term interest rates and see 4.75, and we see 4 on the 10-year.
Yeah.
Right, but you got to think of the total return that is available to you across your portfolio, right? So we believe in balance and diversification to navigate uncertainty in portfolios. So instead of trying to time it and make that shift, gradually make that shift and have the balance and diversification.
All right. Thanks so much, Chris. We really appreciate it. Chris Fasciono, Senior Portfolio Manager of Commonwealth Financial Network. We appreciate that and the take in the market as well. Can I just share with you, Paul, my favorite story of the day?
Go.
Okay. So Home Depot is ordering corporate staff to take 8-hour retail shifts every quarter. I love this story. I always said that there should be like a weekend where you come in and the talent goes behind the camera, and then the camera people come and sit on the camera side, so we all know what we're talking about.
That's a good
and
idea.
we all have like sympathy and empathy for what we're doing. That's pretty cool. This is senior management and remote workers are going to have to complete an 8-hour shift beginning in the fourth quarter of this year. This according to a memo seen by Bloomberg News. There's really nothing I don't love about the story.
That's very cool. Get down into the field.
Yeah. All right. Coming up, we're going to hear more from Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan Chairman and CEO from the Techstars Summit Conference. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We are broadcasting live in Orlando, Florida at the World Center Marriott at Commonwealth's National Conference for Financial Advisors. Well, it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and every day at this time, we are celebrating significant moments in Hispanic heritage. Now with your installment for October 8th, here's Bloomberg's Sebastian Escobar.
Thank you, Paul. In this month in 2014, the fashion world lost an icon with the passing of Dominican fashion designer Oscar de la Renta at the age of 82. De la Renta was the first Latino designer to design for a French house. The Oscar de la Renta brand became famous for its converging European design with American fashion. His house was founded in 1965 in New York, and years later, the brand became known for boosting the public image of several U.S. First Ladies, such as Nancy Reagan, Hillary Clinton, Laura Bush, and Jacqueline Kennedy, as well as some Hollywood A-listers like Oprah Winfrey, Nicole Kidman, and Taylor Swift. His work was known for his refined silk prints, ruffles, and vibrancy while still being luxury casual. Subsequently, Oscar de la Renta also stood out for his humanitarian work, where he founded an orphanage called Casa del Niño and 2 schools with special classes for blind and deaf-mute children in his native Dominican Republic. That's this month in Hispanic Heritage. I'm Sebastian Escobar. Back to you guys.
All right, thanks so much, Sebastian. Really appreciate that. Wearable luxury? I don't know about that. But anyway, Sebastian, thanks a lot. We appreciate that. So JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon spoke to Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowitz at the JP Morgan Techstars conference over in London, and they discussed everything. It was a great interview, from global markets, tech investments, and risks and opportunities within the world of AI. So in this portion of the conversation, Dimon was first asked if he was pessimistic about a soft landing for the U.S. economy.
Soft landings are hard. I hope it happens. I don't know. I just wouldn't count my eggs in that one.
Do you think
and markets are open. When you say open, they're very, values are high. They're not low. Both at equities and bonds, credit spreads are very low. So they're open, but people are saying they're not open for IPOs. So some IPOs, when we just did one of the largest ones of the year, like last week, they're open for those who the market wants to buy today. But don't assume that they're not open. And, sometimes people will go public, they don't like the price. That's a very different thing. And you should think twice about that. When you think you know what a company's worth much more than the market might know.
Yeah, that maybe it's an assessment of what you're looking for rather than the actual market being closed.
Exactly.
You said that there are a lot of inflationary things that are coming down the pike. Do you think that it was a mistake for the Fed to cut by 50 basis points?
No, actually. You got to separate the here and now. Inflation has definitely been coming down. They don't want to go into recession. Unemployment has been going up. They raised rates. They were late raising rates, but they raised it very high, rapidly to 5%, which I think is the right thing. And they're right to take their foot off the gas in that one. I don't think it matters that much, 50, 25, honestly. But I think that was okay. If inflation comes back, I'm looking at future things. The remilitarization of the world's inflationary. The fiscal deficits of the world, particularly the United States, are inflationary. The green economy is inflationary. Demographics are inflationary. It's very possible energy prices down the road, I'm talking about 2-3 years, will be inflationary. Those will hit later. Now, they should react at that time to those things, but I don't think you can anticipate that. We don't know that that's going to happen.
I'm so glad you brought up the deficit. I watched the Treasury auctions. There's another 3-year one today. I watch them every time wondering, are we going to start seeing disruption from some of the concerns that that you bring up, but also every single investor who I speak to says the same thing. Are you surprised that the market hasn't priced in a higher structural deficit in the way of higher yields, or at least more volatility, at least at auctions?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of comments on that one. Commodity markets often don't price things in until they actually happen. And so it hasn't happened yet. The higher inflation, the higher structural stuff, even though the deficits are there, there's also sentiment, inventory, supply and demand of capital goods. So it's very hard to say. But that's why I think that longer rates may actually stay here and tick up a little bit as opposed to go down, because of these huge deficits in the United States. And then the market's reacting, which the word you used of volatile or something like that. It's not always bad. I think we overreact sometimes to volatile markets, but I do think they'll happen again. Dealer inventories are very low. Banks are, the big market makers are very constrained. Not today. We have this anomaly where JP Morgan is going to have $1 trillion of cash and unable to intermediate in treasury markets or repo markets completely conservatively, because we're required to hold that cash in very, like central bank reserves, something like that. So I think when QE finally gets to a certain point, you will see that. I may be wrong. And again, if it happens, I don't think it's a disaster. It's not bad for JP Morgan. I do think policymakers will get upset. They don't like seeing that type of thing. And I think there are fixes to it, and I think they should start working those fixes today.
That was just part of the wide-ranging interview with Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, with Lisa Abramowitz over in London for the JP Morgan Techstars conference. I love when they kind of touched on politics, because Lisa asked him in many different ways, like who was he supporting? Would he take a cabinet position if business leaders were offered? And he was like, look, half the cabinet should be business leaders, because people in government started off as business leaders and people who did stuff, and now they just become career politicians, and then there's this big disconnect, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. He thinks business leaders in general just have a lot of practical experience, and maybe that can have some value within the government as we try to tackle a lot of issues head on, as opposed to just career politicians, perhaps.
Yeah, like
the mix.
Real world, although some CEOs would be a real world. I don't know. There's some nuances there that we want to maybe get into. That wraps it up here from the amazing Commonwealth National Conference for Financial Advisors here in Orlando. We thank you all for letting us be here. It was really great. 10th year that Bloomberg Radio has been here. Now, of course, our time cut a little short with Hurricane Milton barreling towards the west coast there of Florida.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to be a big, big challenge for the good folks in that greater Tampa Bay area. So hopefully they can batten down the hatches and weather this thing out. But we will certainly have current reporting of that throughout the next couple of days.
All right, so Paul and I are off. We're going to go catch our flight in the markets. You're still looking at tech outperforming, helped by NVIDIA. The NASDAQ up over 1 percentage point on pretty high volume. Coming up, Joe Matthew will be joining you with Balance of Power. Happy Tuesday. We'll see you tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Now it's on to Milton. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as a second major hurricane aims for the Gulf Coast with the promise of massive destruction, a huge test for governments on every level, starting at the White House. And we're going to get the latest from Bloomberg's weather expert, Lauren Rosenthal, coming up live from New York. The response to the last storm, Hurricane Helene, is challenged by a barrage of misinformation, some of it coming from the campaign trail. And we'll discuss with Jeffrey Lane Blevins, professor in the Department of Journalism at the University of Cincinnati, a misinformation expert. Kamala Harris and the media blitz today in New York will have insights from our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, alongside Republican strategist Lester Munchin from BGR Group. So let's get to it. Right now, as always, we start on Wall Street. Charlie Pellet and his look at the markets. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Happy Tuesday with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all very much in the green, though. First, we begin with developments out of Washington. Hurricane Milton, President Biden postponing a planned trip to Germany and Angola to focus on the response to Milton, the second major storm in 2 weeks to impact the Southeast. We got more on Hurricane Milton coming up for you in just a moment, right here on Balance of Power. A former New York City official has been charged with witness tampering and destroying evidence in a federal investigation that led to Mayor Eric Adams' bribery indictment. The arrest comes amid yet more high-profile departures from Adams' administration. Gains for the U.S. stock market in general, tech in specific, with the S&P right now up 42, a gain there of 0.8%. NASDAQ now surging 212 points, a gain of 1.2%. NASDAQ 100 index up 1.2%. The Dow up 64, up 0.1%. 10-year 4.02%, with a 2-year 3.96%. Gold down 1.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 4.4%. WTI 73.73 a barrel. J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon says regulators in America and the United Kingdom should make it easier for companies to go public. And speaking with Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowitz at the J.P. Morgan Techstars conference in London, he talked about a number of other topics, including questions about him running for president.
It's more annoying than not, because I can't run for president, you know, and there was no opening. I mean, there's no way that it was even possible. So it's a little flattering, but, you know, I just want to help our government do the right stuff. I think there are a lot of things to do to make America far better off.
J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon speaking with our Lisa Abramowitz at the J.P. Morgan Techstars conference in London. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up 43, up 0.8, 10-year 4.02%. Cannot ignore the move to the downside in crude today. WTI down 4.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much, sir. Always watching the markets for us here on the fastest show in politics. Welcome to the Tuesday edition. I had to check to make sure. This is the world we're in. Yeah, it's still just only Tuesday, with what's already happened so far this week and what could come. The big media blitz today for Kamala Harris. We'll talk more about that. She's already done The View. It's on to Howard Stern. And then Stephen Colbert, as Joe Biden leaves the bubble today, having gotten the hurricane briefing earlier, to travel to Milwaukee, where he's going to talk about cleaning up lead pipes, remembering from the infrastructure law. He also goes to Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, later on, a campaign event for Senator Bob Casey. As I mentioned, Kamala Harris in New York. J.D. Vance is in Detroit today, the swing state of Michigan. But the hurricane, of course, is topping the headlines today, and it will be tomorrow. This is something else. Milton, now at Category 4, down from 5 yesterday, is being described in Florida as a once-in-a-century storm, a once-in-a-100-year storm. We haven't seen a direct hit on Tampa Bay, they say, since 1921. So there you have it. Now, this is only 12 days after Hurricane Helene. And there are a lot of worries about the extent to which this is going to stretch resources, knowing Helene came barreling right through that same area on the Gulf Coast, a little bit further north in the Big Bend area. But the Southeast is having some trouble here. We heard from the mayor of Tampa, Jane Castor, on CNN last night. It's not often you hear public officials talk this way. Quote, "I can say this without any dramatization whatsoever. If you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you are going to die." Unquote. Glad Lauren Rosenthal is with us. Live from New York, Bloomberg weather reporter. Joining us now for the second time in 2 weeks on a major natural disaster. Lauren, it's great to see you. What do we know about landfall and wind speed?
Sure. So we know that Milton is still going to be a major hurricane as it finishes its journey across the Gulf and gets really close to making landfall in Florida, probably sometime tomorrow night. So its top winds will still be very destructive, and what forecasters are really worried about is the risk of storm surge. Milton is getting a lot bigger as it crosses the ocean, and it's going to pick up a lot of water and bring it ashore, inundating communities in Florida that are still cleaning up from Helene less than 2 weeks ago.
What does this mean for Tampa? It looks like there will be a direct hit or something close to it in a city that is in a very precarious situation geographically. What are we about to witness?
Yeah, so Tampa sits on the edge of the West Florida Shelf, which is this really gently sloping land formation. There's shallow water sitting there, and a storm doesn't have to be very strong to be able to pick it up and push that ashore. So we're expecting to see surge of up to 15 feet. That's, rapidly approaching the second story of a two-floor home. Folks are just trying to clean up as best they can from Helene to try to clear the path for Milton, before it arrives tomorrow night. But those cleanup efforts take a long time, and resources are really strapped, so it's definitely been a struggle.
What do you think about that statement from Mayor Castor on CNN last night? Is that accurate? If people don't leave, they die?
It's always a good idea to heed emergency warnings. I talked to Tampa's emergency manager, Barbara Tripp, yesterday, and she said, folks are just used to extreme weather in Florida. She saw people out in the surge from Helene, which was half as bad as Milton's expected to be. She really wants people to pay attention to the warnings coming out of the U.S. National Hurricane Center, coming from the city of Tampa. Get out of the way of the path of this storm. It's not worth trying to stick around. If resources are tight, if you can't find a way out on your own, the state of Florida is offering shuttles to evacuation centers, and I think I saw that ride-sharing apps like Uber are also offering free rides. So, if folks can figure out a way out, they do need to pay attention to those warnings just to be safe.
Well, this will be even more urgent tomorrow, Lauren, and we'd love to stay in touch with you to the extent that you can join us here on Balance of Power. Lauren Rosenthal reporting on the storm for Bloomberg in New York. It's scary stuff, and again, the proximity to the most recent storm makes this even more complicated. We're still trying to get to some areas. When you talk about the response, it's trying to get to some areas in western North Carolina that were devastated by Hurricane Helene. Massive flooding, people displaced from their homes in areas where they never thought they'd be having that kind of a conversation. And it's been compounded by what is being called a misinformation campaign in some publications, and it's hard to argue with that. Donald Trump, of course, has been leading the charge to some extent in questioning the federal response, issuing statements and speeches and putting statements on Truth Social about the $750 if you lose your house and so forth. There's been some pretty good reporting on this. Politico was leading the charge on it this morning. The consequences on full display. They spoke with a state official from North Carolina who described the overwhelming deluge of false information and what it has meant for people in need. At best, a distraction. At worst, it is obstructing needy Americans from getting the help they need, falsely suggesting, for instance, that victims, as I mentioned, are entitled to no more than a $750 check. He described it as the Thunderdome, and people are just pumping the noise in. That's where we start our conversation. With Jeffrey Lane Blevins, we wanted to talk to an expert on misinformation at a critical time in the response to this storm. Professor in the Department of Journalism at the University of Cincinnati, and appropriately for our conversation, author of Social Media, Social Justice, and the Political Economy of Online Networks. Mr. Blevins, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's been some time, and appreciate your being with us here as we try to figure out what in the world is going on. There was a time when a natural disaster like this would bring out the gougers, right? You'd see gas prices go through the roof. Maybe scammers would be afoot trying to do stuff in a storm zone when people were vulnerable. Now it's a political opportunity to use misinformation, but to what end?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's good to be with you again, although it's disappointing what we're talking about. But when we think about misinformation, I think we should also consider the term disinformation, because we have entities that are putting this information, is false information, out there for political purpose. To undermine the credibility of government institutions and our credible news outlets. And when people when they have access to that that disinformation, they are likely to believe it's true, and so they spread it, and that's what I would consider to be misinformation. And it's an unfortunate thing to see.
Well, it sure is. We've heard reports of some folks turning away help from FEMA because they're reading on social media that federal officials are confiscating their goods. Are we in a place where it's not possible for the federal government to succeed in recovering from a storm?
Well, I think that's is part of the goal. And actually, I think that the goal is actually a little bit cheaper than that, is simply to, discredit, the Biden administration. And what an awful way to try to score political points, at the lives of people who have already been, affected by a natural disaster. This is the time that we need to be able to rely on and trust our government and trust our federal resources. It's despicable to me, frankly.
Well, speak to me about the role that Elon Musk is playing in this when we talk about online disinformation. There have been a number of posts, a couple dozen, in fact, that have been challenged that are still up on his X platform, what we used to call Twitter, that are reinforcing the rhetoric we're hearing from Donald Trump and even some kind of wackier conspiracy theories. Does this alliance between Donald Trump and Elon Musk result in an even more dangerous situation?
Well, it certainly, doesn't help. And, in the past, I used to give someone like Musk kind of the benefit of the doubt when he was, just a user of then Twitter. And I'm like, well, maybe he's, really, misinformed. But he does seem to be part and parcel, of this. Now, at the very least, he should take more responsibility for what he shares. This is, kind of the message of, my recent scholarship is that, as audiences, we have to take more responsibility for what we like, what we repost. And that's especially true for politicians, for influencers, for public figures. It's not enough to say, oh, well, this is out there, and how am I supposed to know, what's a credible source and what's not? That's a really cheap out.
Well, it's pretty amazing to see anti-Semitic attacks against some of the elected officials, for instance, in North Carolina, who are trying to deal with the storm. A lot of this really brings us back to North Carolina, and much of it has been borne on X. The Washington Post did some reporting here focusing on 33 recent viral X posts that spread misinformation about Hurricane Helene, and caused at least 231 deaths, of course, and widespread devastation. The posts collectively attracted 159 million views. How do you combat that wave of false information?
Right. Well, and this is, again, where I think our our influencers and our politicians have to take more responsibility. A lot of times, folks want to blame it on, the algorithm or algorithms in general. Well, here's the thing. Algorithms, they only do what they are programmed to do. And they are programmed to keep users engaged. And, so whatever you like, whatever you respond to, comment on, whatever you share, well, the algorithm takes note of that, and so it feeds you more of that type of information, or in this case, misinformation, and it really creates a disinformation or misinformation bubble, if you will, where you're like, well, this is this has gone viral. So many different, users have shared it. And so it makes it seem credible when it's not.
To what extent is AI making this a more difficult situation to manage here? A lot of the posts we're talking about include AI-generated images of things that never happened.
Right. And not everyone, not every user has access or knows how to use a reverse image, a lookup tool, or, thinks to use a fact-checking service. And, there are several of them. USA Today, for instance, has a whole team of fact-checkers. They take tips to run these things down. But it always takes a long time for the truth to catch up while these things are going viral. And it makes it, incredibly difficult once that genie is out of the bottle, so to speak, to put it back in and say, oh, wait a minute, that's not accurate. And I think, what we can, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It just says a lot about where we are, Professor. When I go to FEMA's website, FEMA.gov, and they've got a rumor response page. In fact, if you search for this on Google, it's the first result that you get. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
It's unfortunate that it comes to that. But what I would add is that, a lot on the far political right has spent decades, demonizing, and undercutting, government agencies, so that you have a lot of people that are primed not to trust them, not to believe them. So, the very agencies that they should be looking toward, they're simply, going to discredit. I think what we need to do is, as media audiences, though, is we need more, media literacy, and be aware that, hey, there is something out there that, called AI that can generate these things, can look really persuasive, and we have to be, on guard and be willing to check multiple sources, and also be willing to have some of our preconceived, political dispositions challenged.
Maybe that's what I'll do in my next life. I'll do a media literacy class. Professor, it's great to have you back. We thank you for the time. Jeffrey Blevins, Department of Journalism, University of Cincinnati. An hour from now, we're going to talk to Representative Kathy Castor, Democrat from Florida, speaking about this earlier today in Politico. The partisan political motivations behind disinformation campaigns are insidious, she says, manipulating the facts, using a natural disaster to build political capital is a disgraceful tactic. We'll have our conversation with the Congresswoman in our second hour, so stay with us right here. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. President Biden says he is postponing a planned trip to Germany and Angola to remain at the White House to monitor Hurricane Milton, which is bearing down on Florida's Gulf Coast. Milton is building up a potentially disastrous storm surge as it churns towards Florida's west coast, where flooding and high winds are expected to inflict widespread damage and put lives at risk. Milton's top winds are now 150 miles an hour, making it a Category 4 hurricane. And U.S. Supreme Court justices have indicated they are likely to let President Biden's administration regulate build-at-home ghost gun kits in a clash over a rule designed to stem a torrent of untraceable weapons. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all rallying here. Tech stocks leading the way higher. NASDAQ up 209, up 1.2%. The NASDAQ 100 index also up 1.2%. S&P up 42, a gain of 0.7%. Dow Industrials up 61, up 0.1%. 10-year, 4.02%. The 2-year, 3.96%. Spot gold down $28 the ounce, down 1.1%, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 4.7%, $73.50 now for a barrel of WTI. Ever wish that your boss could try your job for a day? Well, Home Depot will begin requiring corporate employees to work a full day at one of its stores every quarter, a move the company says is aimed at supporting its retail staff. Again, recapping, S&P up 42, up 0.7% for on-demand news 24 hours a day. Subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. From the terminal to your radio and on YouTube as well, where you can find us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. Yes, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thank you, Charlie Pellet, in New York. With a lot of questions about the Kamala Harris campaign and list of proposals that make up something called a platform. We've been very slowly filling in the blanks here. And you like to think that maybe the 3 interviews that she's doing today in the town hall later on this week with Univision will start to fill in more of those blanks. It just has been difficult so far. When you're a guy like Nathan Dean, running things at Bloomberg Intelligence, and you're doing 40 events a week, these are the questions people are asking you about. What about the deficit? She was asked about that last night in the 60 Minutes special, Maya McGinnis's new research. How are you going to pay for the tax cuts? A lot of questions like that that might, in fact, drive people's decisions if they're coming at this from a markets, economy, and investment standpoint. And I'm glad to say that he is with us right now. Senior U.S. policy analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, Nathan Dean, with what, 4 events this week? This guy's in high demand. I could have to buy tickets just to see you. Great to see you, by the way. What is the number one question? Because I always remind people, your phone's ringing off the hook. You're hearing from actual clients, subscribers who have questions about policy that drive investment decisions. What are the most common phone calls you're getting right now?
Yeah, so from the American investors, so from the folks in New York, the biggest question we're getting is, what's the odds of a Congress where you have reconciliation in play next year, and then potentially you have this idea for a multi-trillion-dollar package that could add to the deficit, whether it's tax cuts or an Inflation Reduction Act 2.0, what is going to happen with the tax debate next year? Because the Trump-era tax cuts expire at the tail end of 2025, so we know that there's going to be pressure to keep those $3 trillion individual tax cuts extended for, the next 7 years.
Yeah.
For the non-U.S. investor, a lot of it comes down to tariffs and the Inflation Reduction Act. For tariffs, do we get broad tariffs from President Trump, or do we get targeted tariffs from Vice President Harris? And when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, does it get tweaked to help pay for some of these tax cuts? There's a lot of CapEx coming into the United States, into the renewable industry, a lot of it coming from Europe. And so the question is, are those tax carrots, if you will, still going to be there, or are they going to be gutted to help pay for that tax reform?
She was asked on 60 Minutes last night about the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, finding that her plans would add some $3 trillion to the deficit. Maya McGinnis was on with us yesterday as she cracked the seal on this new research. And the vice president's answer was largely, we're going to tax the rich to pay for this. I don't know if they've scored, if it's a better term, you can tell me what it is, that proposal. But I'm guessing that generates some concern over the people you're hearing from.
Well, I would also just remind everybody that the president is just one of 3 parts of the U.S. government. Because for every president campaign statement you have about tax, there's a tax policy wonk over at the House of Representatives who's saying, thank you, Madam or Mr. President, but the House and Ways and Means Committee is going to also have their own views on this. So if you think about next year, if Kamala Harris wins, chances are the House will go to the Dems, but the Senate is going to be very difficult for the Dems to pick up. So if the Republicans keep the Senate, reconciliation's not at play, which means any of these tax changes have to be negotiated, which means they're going to be constricted. Taxing the wealthy, certainly feasible, but it'll be much more difficult if the Republicans take the Senate. And so what we're telling our clients and so forth is always just keep in mind how the process plays out. And when it comes to taxes, we think the corporate tax rate could be tweaked a little bit, but those individual tax cuts are expensive. You're talking $3 trillion plus just to keep those in play. So things like if you're talking about gutting the Inflation Reduction Act to pay for it, the Inflation Reduction Act is much cheaper, and you still have to cut a lot more to keep those tax. So there potentially could be a tax raise coming.
Sure, huge questions here. And if you think it's likely, then I'm assuming you mean under a Kamala Harris win that the House goes Democratic.
Well, I mean,
or is that in any scenario?
In any scenario, I mean, like obviously,
is it just as likely the Senate goes Republican?
Well, I mean, we're just always saying, if you look at the Senate races right now, it's 51-49. West Virginia, Senator Manchin's retiring, and so it doesn't probably need to be any of us to know that West Virginia will probably go to the Republicans. But there are some very difficult races that the Democrats have in order to keep the Senate. Senator Sherrod Brown, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee in Ohio. Senator John Tester, also a member of the Senate Banking Committee. And so the Democrats have to have a great night. And so I think the investor perspective is that the Republicans are going to keep the Senate. The big question is the House and the presidency.
Okay.
Sorry, the Republicans will take the Senate.
Understood. In that world, you're not going to legalize cannabis, which I understand Kamala Harris wants to do. I was really struck by how little coverage this got. She did this podcast, All the Smoke, and it's, not only about marijuana, but she made clear, quote, I just feel strongly people should not be going to jail for smoking weed. We've gotten to the point where we have to understand that we need to legalize it and stop criminalizing this behavior. This is the Matt Barnes, Stephen Jackson podcast. We're talking about federal legalization. We can't even get a Safe Banking Act through this Congress. Is that pie in the sky?
So I think there's three issues when it comes to marijuana and how they impact these hot sauce marijuana equities that we cover. The first is full legalization. Our view on it is that it's not going to happen anytime soon. Even if President Trump wins, in that Truth Social post that he posted about marijuana, he said mostly defer to the states on this.
Right.
The second thing is the Safer Banking Act. I think the Safer Banking Act can eventually get there. It's just not going to be a tier one priority. Maybe 2026, somewhere. I think the most important catalyst for anybody who's looking at marijuana equities right now from the policy perspective is reschedulization. Because both Kamala Harris and President Trump have said that moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 is something they're in supportive of, and it's also something they can control, bypass the opposition, because they have the power of the regulatory mindset. Now, we've heard anecdotally that the DEA is still not on board with that. It may take some time, but we do think that reschedulization to Schedule 3 will happen, and as a result, these marijuana equities will get tax relief, and their tax rates go from like 40% down to like 5%.
You were pretty shrewd to slow people down on that story earlier this year when the ball started rolling on reschedulization. You're not surprised it hasn't happened yet.
Well, look, it's Washington. What happens if fast in Washington? I mean, nothing...
This one, though, had opposition that might not have been on the front page when it first came up. Like you said, internal concerns at the DEA.
Well, look, I mean, reschedulization and marijuana is a tough issue to move through Congress no matter what, because it's historically been illegal. It's federally illegal. It's still federally illegal. And it's not something that I think the federal government has come to be able to come together and move quicker than we've seen in the states. Obviously, we've got 38 plus states that are moving to either decriminalization or legalization. But, as with the filibuster and institutional knowledge of the Senate and so forth, it's just something that, people just generally haven't been able to gravitate to. Now, we were wrong on safe banking. I thought safe banking was going to move in the last congressional term. It hasn't. So we think that this is eventually coming, and we do think legalization will eventually come, full federal legalization, but it's just not going to be fast. It's still years away.
Years away, and it doesn't matter in that case who's elected president, right? If you've got them both with a similar approach here.
Yeah.
Harris administration, Trump administration, same outcome.
Yeah, because we're talking about the Senate. I mean, it really comes down to the Senate. I mean, obviously the House has, depending on who controls the House of Representatives, it could go either way and so forth like that. But I think it ultimately comes down to the Senate because of the filibuster. Now, I think you could probably get 60 plus votes if you were to give a bunch of senators truth serum. But I think just because of the politics at play, the tough on crime aspect and so forth, I'm not sure it's there. I think there needs to be another generational change, if you will. Maybe a couple, 3-4 years line, but I would also note, I'm certainly out of consensus on this compared to some of the other marijuana analysts out there.
Well, listen, it could happen then, and whomever the next president has for I guess Donald Trump's second term or Kamala Harris's first. I'm curious about unrealized gains. This is something we've not heard Kamala Harris talk about. Taxing unrealized gains, capital gains, a new way to approach this. Do you still hear questions about this, or have we moved on?
So we hear questions about it. I mean, I was talking to our tax analyst, Andrew Silverman, about this, and it's certainly questions that we come in, but there's really no anticipation of it going forward. I don't think anybody really anticipates that this is going to come into the discussion. I think it is certainly as a campaign point that they can point out and so forth like that.
Yes.
But the biggest cost of tax reform is those individual tax cuts. And you're either going to have to figure out ways to pay for it, most likely through the corporate tax, which is currently capped at 21%, or you're going to have to cut things or just say we're not going to pay for it. And so there's
we're used to that.
It's really easy to say that you're going to do something right now. It's going to be very difficult when you and I have this conversation in August of 2025 and the tax reform debate is kicking off, because now you got to figure out how you're going to pay for it. And I don't think there's a lot of easy solutions there.
Especially when nobody's being honest about it. I mean, the Trump campaign says we'll grow out of it, right? Revenues went up when the Trump tax cuts were first passed. And the Harris campaign says we'll soak the rich. Are either of those plausible?
Well, it's certainly plausible. I mean, the soak the rich, again, depends on the makeup of Congress. And if the Republicans take the Senate, then I don't think that's really going to have the same impact as if it would under a Democratic Senate. And in terms of the growth, that's something that we see from both administrations, both parties going back years and years and years. There's a little line item that says economic growth, and we'll pay for it. And Congress gets away with it a lot. So don't be surprised if that certainly
is that an eye roll, though? And what do people think? When you hear from clients on that, they're more sophisticated than most voters when it comes to matters of the economy.
Well, I think a lot of the clients we hear, and this is especially coming from New York, is at what point does the deficit become something for Washington? Because what I tell to them is that Washingtonian politicians don't really care about the deficit all that much. I mean, obviously, if we have a debt ceiling debate next year, we'll talk about it. But economic growth pays for a lot of it. But there is a genuine concern in New York that, the deficit is growing, and there will come a point where Washington is going to have to respond. I just don't think it's going to be in the next congressional term or even in the next administration for the next 4 years.
You can watch The View, you can listen to Howard Stern, Stephen Colbert, or you can call Nathan Dean. That's going to be a very different conversation, I'm guessing. We're not filling any blanks on these interviews today, right?
No. I mean,
might be some laughs, might be some fun, but
we're certainly going to watch them. But I don't think it's going to. I don't think we're going to have our reactions out tomorrow morning.
When does the Kamala Harris BI interview happen? Now, that would be something to watch. Nathan, thank you. Good luck on the road and in your travels. If you're lucky enough to have Nathan Dean speaking to your group, we salute you. We do this every week with the chief policy analyst here at Bloomberg Intelligence. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next as we follow Kamala Harris on the media tour today in New York, with much more coming up here on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you.
1240 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Hurricane Milton on track to deal a devastating blow to Florida's vibrant Tampa Bay region, potentially delivering the first direct hit from a hurricane